Greetings. This is Ayman Tarabishi, ICSB Executive Director for the International Council for Small Business and Deputy Chair of the Department of Management at the George Washington University. I am delighted to have here with us Mrs. Vicky Staninou, IPA Group Executive for Advocacy and Technical. Here, Vicky, how are you?
Hi, Ayman. I'm very well, thank you. And how are you?
I'm doing very well. It's 8 o'clock, but where 8 a.m. exactly are you?
I'm in Canberra in Australia. It's our national capital. It's on the east coast of Australia, about a 3-hour drive from Sydney, or a half-hour plane ride from Sydney.
So you're on the other side of the world, or we are on the other side of the world for you, but we are so delighted to have you here in the ICSB Exchange webinar.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Absolutely. We have a fantastic presentation that I've looked at the slides and we're really excited to get into it. So as usual, what will happen here with the webinar is you will just go through the slides and you can tell me I'm going to move it to next. So it'll be very easy for you to have a conversation. And after that, I'll ask you some questions and then we'll open up to the attendees for some questions. Is that okay with you?
Yep, sounds wonderful.
Good. So why don't we go ahead and start, and I'll mute my phone and you just tell me next slide and we'll go from there.
Great, thanks. Okay, let's get going. The presentation is called Toughest Year of Our Lives, an Australian Response to COVID-19. And this comes from a quote from our Prime Minister, who's the equivalent of the US President. He gave a speech and he used those terms. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so just to give you an idea of some of the things I want to talk about, and I won't go through everything in detail, but just to give you some context of where Australia sits in terms of the health statistics and the health response. Some of the containment measures that I think will be familiar to most of us, and then just a reference to the Prime Minister's perspective, because I think it gives us context from a national approach. And then I want to go into sort of at a high level of the economic response that Australia has had. So like many countries, we've implemented stimulus packages. So far, we've had 3 with a whole lot of other measures. And the Prime Minister and the government have not ruled out more stimulus packages. Then I just want to give a very high level view of some of the state government responses, because like the US and other countries, we have a federal government, but then we also have state governments. We also have a 3rd level of government, local government, but I won't go into some of the measures that they've introduced. And then I just want to have a quick sort of high view look at the wage subsidy packages that have been introduced in different countries. And the wage subsidies have been a sort of a cornerstone of a lot of the stimulus packages. And then economic position of Australia. Australia's in a pretty good economic position going into this crisis. And then just looking at some of the policies and the responses, because obviously the stimulus packages are based on a particular policy perspective. There's been a whole lot of academic research on this policy, and I've had a look through quite a bit of it, but there's not enough time to go through it in detail. But there has been quite a bit of academic research on some of the labour market policies that have been introduced around the world. And then, of course, we sit in a very much a globalised world with institutions like the G20, and they've been quite active during this crisis. Then I just want to conclude with some questions about what does it all mean going forward. It's going to be a new normal, and I think we're all pretty much agreed that we're going to be seeing a very different world post-pandemic. So next slide. So just in terms of health statistics, as at for us 15th of April was yesterday, but Australia, with a population of 25 million, has done reasonably well in containing the crisis. And I think that's probably because we're an island and we can close our borders quite readily. We've had so far over 6,000 deaths, sorry, 6,000 confirmed cases, I should say, 63 deaths, which is quite a low level. And a lot of that is because we've had a very high level of testing. In fact, some say that we've got the highest definitely one of the highest, if not the highest level of testing in the world, with over 3,600 cases that have recovered. So you can see from the chart there up to the 10th of April that we've done pretty well in flattening the curve. And there are very few new cases of infection coming through every day. So we've done pretty well. But as the government keeps telling us, we can't take the foot off the pedal just yet. Okay, next slide. Okay, some of the containment measures that have led to the flattening of the curve, and I think most people around the world will be familiar with these. We've closed our international borders. We've got social distancing. For us, it's 1.5 meters apart, which is less than 6 feet. In some countries, it's like the UK, it's 2 meters, which is 6 feet. Most of us are staying at home, working from home if possible. That's been quite widespread. Public gatherings have gone from initially 500 down to 200, down to 100, and now it's 2. So only 2 people outside of the household are allowed to gather together. We've got a lot of extensive measures around self-isolation and self-quarantine. We're down to essential travel only. We can go out to buy food. Some of us go out to buy coffee. There's a lot of takeaway food because the restaurants have closed. We can go out to look after the vulnerable and to have some exercise. And of course, things like good hygiene are pretty essential. There's been some controversy here about the schools. The schools are actually controlled and education is controlled by the state governments, but the federal government has also intervened and said that the schools can remain open. However, most schools and most students are now being schooled from home. So there's been a huge pivot to online learning, and most schools at primary and high school level are now operating digitally. And of course, no one is allowed to travel unless it's absolutely essential and you get permission. Okay, next slide. Okay, so our Prime Minister Scott Morrison gave quite a rousing speech to Parliament earlier this month in April. And basically he was saying that we're in a good position going forward with this pandemic. So we've been kind of lucky. We've seen what's happened in other countries and we've been able to adjust our response accordingly. We're also lucky because we're in a strong economic position. So that's going to help us with our stimulus packages, but also very much to make sure that we've got health supplies, medical supplies, and that our hospitals are as ready as they can be to fight the pandemic. Okay, next slide. Okay, so going into the economic stimulus packages, we've had 3 so far with a whole lot of other measures plus the state's stimulus packages, and every state has introduced a package. So our first package was on the 12th of March, and it was very much aimed at trying to put some cash and some liquidity back into the markets. And it was focused very much on businesses and giving them some cash flow, because already we were seeing as businesses were shutting down, especially like restaurants and cafes and the like, that already people were starting to be laid off. There's of course a flow-on effect to other businesses. So the first stimulus package was very much aimed at putting some tax-free money into the hands of those businesses, including a lot of small businesses. 97% of all businesses in Australia are small businesses, and they very much they employ nearly 50% of the workforce. So it was really critical to start getting some money into the hands of those businesses. And you can see there were things like wage subsidies for trainees, tax-free cash payments. The money was available to a wide variety of entities, from charities, not-for-profits, partnerships, companies, etc. And very much the government has tried to stagger the payments through the economy and also through time, rather than have sort of a big one lump hit at the beginning and then seeing how we're going. So it's been very much a deliberate, ongoing continuation of payments. In terms of the second stimulus package, which was announced on the 22nd of March, so 10 days after the first one, this was a bigger boost with more money flowing through, a lot more money. And this one was also very much aimed at individuals and households. So there was more money now being given to those that are receiving government support, Social Security. One support's even called the coronavirus supplement. And there's been cash payments of $750. There's been more tax-free money, cash flow given to small businesses, this time a lot more money, up to $100,000 to help them with their operating costs. And the government's guaranteeing 50% of business loans for SMEs. So, and this has increased the lending, they've also increased the lending capacity. So it's very much aimed at getting a lot more money into the economy to start flowing through, to put us into hibernation so that we can last the pandemic in reasonable shape. Okay, next slide. Going into the third stimulus package, the most recent one, this was announced 8 days after the second one on the 30th of March. And this one was worth $130 billion. So each stimulus package, we've gone from 16 to 66 to $130 billion. So each stimulus package has introduced more and more cash and more liquidity into the market. It's very much, we've had the package aimed at households, individuals and businesses. So the government's looked at all the different sectors of the economy that are going to keep us going and tried to make sure, because we're in uncharted waters here, so no one really knows what's going to work, but with very much, it's been aimed at trying to help each of those sectors in terms of households, businesses and individuals. And in terms of the industries, there has been some specific stimulus package given to particular industries, like those that are the hardest hit, like for example, hospitality and tourism. However, the government's also tried to spread the stimulus package throughout the entire economy because their flow-on effects have been quite extraordinary. Now, the cornerstone of this particular package was the wage subsidy, which is called Jobkeeper. So at first we had the job seeker, which was for people who lost their employment altogether. And now we've got the Jobkeeper payment. And this has been very much aimed at employers to try and keep their employees on the books. So we want people to keep their jobs, even if they're not actually working, like for example, a chef. The restaurant might be closed and they might not be working, but the idea is to keep them on the books and to keep them paid. So there's been $1,500 a fortnight. These are going to be paid monthly, and they're starting at the beginning of May and will be back paid to the 1st of March. So this is $750 a week. The distinguishing feature here is that it's a flat payment. Unlike other countries, which you'll see later, instead of having a proportionate payment, this is a flat fee, a flat payment. So even if you've earned less than $1,500 a fortnight before the pandemic, you will now receive $1,500. So it means for some people that they're going to get more money, more pay now from this payment than they did before. For others, it will mean they won't be getting as big a subsidy in terms of the proportion of their pay, but the idea is that their employers will then top up the payment up to what they used to be paid. Now, the $1,500 is 70% of the median wage. It's not much more above the minimum wage, but it's also 100% of the median wage for people in hospitality and related industries. So it's been very much sort of aimed at the bulk of the people who have lost their jobs so far in those particular hard hit frontline kind of industries. So it's a flat payment. Now, it also means, however, that some people are going to miss out. And there's been criticism because the scheme doesn't cover the short-term casuals, who are people who've been working for less than 12 months for the same employer, and it doesn't cover particular visa holders. There has been some extension of the payment to temporary visa holders, but unlike as in other countries, not all visa holders are going to be covered by this payment. The idea would be that if you don't qualify for this, most people will qualify for the job seeker payment. And if, of course, your employer decides not to keep you on the books and to make you unemployed, then you go onto the job seeker payment, which is essentially the unemployment benefit. The unemployment benefit, however, has been virtually doubled. So it's a lot more than it was before. And the idea here is to keep people on the books so that when we get through the pandemic, businesses can quickly reactivate and get back to how business was, hopefully. So that's the idea, so that they will be saved from having to go through the hassle of rehiring staff. They'll already have their staff on the books. It's also good for employees because it means that they can be better connected to their business and to their work, their employer, through the crisis. So all round, there's benefits for employers and employees. And like many other countries, the wage subsidy part of the package has been quite integral to getting us through the pandemic. The reasons why Australia's chosen a flat payment rather than a proportionate payment is because, as the government has said, it's the Australian way. And that basically means we like to think of ourselves as being egalitarian. Everyone's treated the same. No matter how much money you get paid, you're all treated the same. That's the idea behind the flat payment. Okay, next slide. Okay, just a bit more detail about the Jobkeeper scheme, because it has been quite a big part of the packages. The payment's going to all different types of entities, not-for-profit, self-employed, etc. It's not, however, going to public authorities, unlike the British scheme. So it is restricted in that way. Now, there is an eligibility criteria. If the business has an aggregated turnover of less than $1 billion, which is most businesses in Australia, then you must have suffered a fall in your turnover of at least 30% comparable to a previous period. So your turnover has to have fallen by at least 30%. If your turnover is over $1 billion, then it has to have fallen by 50%. So the government's looking at not just SMEs, but also at big businesses. And we're starting to see some pain there. For example, Virgin Australia, one of our two main airlines, is saying that they might be going into administration, and they've been asking for a massive bailout from the government. So we are starting to see the effects flow through to larger businesses. The turnover and eligibility criteria has caused some confusion. A lot of people aren't quite sure how to work it out. And our tax office, which is the equivalent of the IRS in the US, has just issued some guidance on how you work out fall in turnover. And essentially, they have given the tax commissioner, the government has given him a lot of discretion to work out the fall in turnover test, so that if you don't have a comparable period from the previous year, then you can provide information to show that you have had a fall in your turnover by at least 30%. And the commissioner will accept lots of other information because, for example, you might be in a cyclical business, you might be a new business, you might be a startup, you might have had a major acquisition, which will affect your turnover. So all of those things can be taken into consideration. It's quite unusual to give the tax commissioner this much discretion. However, because these are unprecedented times, the government has decided that it's warranted And the idea really is to try and give as much money as possible to as many businesses as possible to keep them going through the pandemic. So, as I've said, the packages are basically designed to support workers, households and businesses, but also bearing in mind that some will suffer more than others, and trying to put a safety net under them. And that's why, like, the unemployment benefit has been doubled, basically. And there's been a lot of relief for people renting. There's been a lot, even the banks, our 4 main banks have given deferment packages for mortgages. So there's been a lot of support from a lot of different sectors of the economy. Okay, next slide. There's been a whole lot of other economic measures and packages. There's been the 3 main stimulus packages, but there's been a whole raft of other things. Our Reserve Bank, which is the equivalent of the Fed, which is our central bank, has announced a $90 billion 3-year funding facility to help the banks to lend. Our banks are actually in pretty good shape. They came out of the GFC quite strongly. So I think that's been a welcome aspect to our economy. But the Reserve Bank has certainly acted to help them as well, by putting more money into the economy and making sure that those who need cash and need funding can get it. And not just from the big banks, but also the smaller banks. There's been a lot of rent relief going around. Certainly the states have jumped on this. It means you can't evict anyone, either commercial or residential tenancies. You can't evict anyone for at least 6 months. And there's also a mandatory code of conduct that's been put into place to make sure that landlords, especially commercial landlords, do the right thing by their tenants. There's also been relief from insolvency laws. It means that, that they've been relaxed essentially. So the laws around trading whilst insolvent, those especially have been relaxed to give people even more support. There's been all sorts of other grants. We've recently, in January, we had the worst bushfires in our history. I think a lot of people saw Australia burning on the television. We're still recovering from the impacts of the bushfires. It affected a lot of small businesses, and the government has put forward a lot of recovery packages for that, especially small business. So for those people, you know, they've had a double disaster, double crisis, bushfires followed immediately by the pandemic. But businesses can access both packages. There's also been money given to the childcare sector, because of course some people have to go to work and they might not be able to look after their children because the schools have closed. So the government's also helping them. And tax liabilities have been deferred for 4 months. So altogether, those packages are worth 320 billion Australian dollars, which is 16.4% of GDP. And I think it was the IMF the other day and the OECD have both said that that's a pretty good package in terms of size, because of course the bigger the package and the bigger the size of support, the more likely we are to come out of this slightly less scathed. Okay, next slide. Okay, state governments. In Australia, we have 6 states and 2 territories. So there's the federal government and then there's the states and territories. So each of the states have announced their own stimulus packages in addition to those offered by the federal government. And collectively, these packages are worth nearly $13 billion. So they cover a whole range of things. And you can see on the slide, there's everything from tax relief and waivers on government fees. There's been a lot of reductions in payroll tax, which is often a bugbear of business. There's been loan facilities, spending on infrastructure has been brought forward, and all sorts of other things. So the states have also weighed in quite heavily to try and support the various state-based economies. Okay, next slide. Now, as I said before, wage subsidies have been a large part of the various stimulus packages in a lot of different countries. So we know the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Canada, the US, Denmark have all introduced wage subsidy schemes of differing types. But the rationale is the same in all countries. And also when I looked at the active labour market policies, it's essentially to put some liquidity into the market. But in terms of the pandemic, the idea is to freeze the economy or to put it into hibernation. One commentator called it a medically induced coma. So we want to put it into hibernation, and then the idea is once we're over the pandemic to thaw out the economy, and some people call it snapping back to where we were. There's been differences of opinion about how we can snap back or how we can rebound back once these measures are unwound, and how quickly and easily we can unfreeze ourselves out of hibernation will depend very much on how long the pandemic goes on for and how deep the pain and the suffering is for the economy. Now, the United Kingdom introduced what they called the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. And the interesting thing here is that there's no eligibility criteria as such like there is in Australia. It covers all businesses, but it doesn't cover all employees. So it only covers the employees who've been stood down, and it covers 80% of their usual wages. So you can see the differences already to the Australian scheme. Ours is a flat fee. This one is a proportionate payment, 80% of wages. Ours has an eligibility criteria. The UK one doesn't. The Australian one, also like the New Zealand one, covers all employees, including those who are still working. The United Kingdom one doesn't. If you're still working, you're not eligible and your business is not going to get a wage subsidy for you. So it covers more businesses, but fewer employees, whereas the Australian and New Zealand ones cover fewer businesses, but more employees. As to which one's going to be more effective in its particular context remains to be seen, but they're just some of the differences. Okay, next slide. Okay, so New Zealand has got the wage subsidy scheme. I've already referred to their scheme, but they've interestingly have come up with a lump sum which covers 12 weeks, which is something that in Australia we've avoided giving lump sums, because the problem with lump sums is that people may be tempted to spend them in one hit rather than to have an ongoing payment. They've got a similar kind of eligibility criteria in that there has to have been at least a 30% decline in revenue compared to last year. They've got a slightly different comparison there in terms of they've got to the year before any period between January and June. But also in New Zealand, unlike the US, the business has to have made some endeavour to pay part of the income and to take steps to mitigate the impact, as for example, going to their bank. So they have to have sought credit elsewhere. And then Canada has got the emergency wage subsidy. Again, it's like New Zealand and the UK, it's a proportionate payment. In this case, 75% of the employee's wages up to a cap of $8.47 a week. So you can see we've got 70% of wages, 75% of wages, 80% of wages, and a flat fee across those different countries. And again, there's an eligibility criteria in the Canadian system. So a business has to have suffered a drop of gross revenues of at least 15% in March and 30% in April and May, which is kind of interesting because to me that's more complicated than our system, which is just a 30% drop in revenue. So then moving on to the United States, The US has introduced the Paycheck Protection Program, which is again a different system. It's introduced forgivable loans to small businesses to pay employees. But it's interesting because the money can be used for other things, but no more than 25% can be used for non-payroll costs. So it kind of covers wages, but it covers operating costs as well. Whereas in Australia, we've treated them quite separately. We've given businesses cash payments for their operating costs, which have been quite high, as opposed to a straight out wage subsidy. The difference, I suppose, also is that in Australia, the wage subsidy goes to the employer, but must be paid to the employee. And it must be paid to them without any deductions. It goes through the tax system. So it's using existing mechanisms, and it can be easily verified by the tax office. The US system is quite different. It goes through the lenders, the SBA lenders and other lenders, so other approved lenders. So it's kind of, it achieves the same outcome, or it's intended to achieve the same outcome, but using quite a different mechanism. Okay, next slide. And I just very quickly want to say that Australia is in a pretty good position economically going into this crisis. The IMF and the OECD have forecast that we'll grow faster than other comparable economies. So hopefully this will play out and we'll be in, well, we'll see what shape we're in at the end of the pandemic. Unemployment, like in most countries, is expected to increase dramatically. At the moment, we're betting on about double the rate, but it could be higher. Okay, next slide. Okay, some of the policy rationales for the stimulus packages, and also based on the economic position that we're in, is that as we learnt from the GFC, go hard, go early and go households. And that's basically what the government's done through designing the measures for the pandemic as well. But of course, the two immediate goals, as for most countries, we have to protect people in terms of their health, and we have to protect the economy at the same time. So doing those things at the same time is really part of the difficulty, and it's unprecedented for all of us. The other thing is that we have to try and make sure that we protect the most vulnerable. The International Labour Organization has got some pretty scary estimates of potentially how many people can be impacted or will be impacted and possibly pushed into poverty or back into poverty. So we've got to do more in terms of our policy settings to ensure that everyone is protected as much as possible. Okay, next slide. And just talking about the ILO, they've got their 4 pillars of policy responses to COVID-19. I won't go through them in any detail, but I think a lot of the things that they're talking about, like wage subsidies and financial support, protecting the most vulnerable, and ensuring that we're building trust and confidence between the government and the population. I think those are the sorts of things that most countries and most governments are trying to include in their responses to COVID-19. So it's a pretty good framework. And I think most countries are doing as much as they can around these things. Okay, next slide. There's been a lot of academic research on active labour market policies. Part of that is wage subsidies. I think some of it will be useful when we're looking at recovery from COVID-19. I know in Australia, the government's been very much looking at what does recovery look like and how are we going to put ourselves in the best position possible to have the best recovery possible. So some of the academic research on how you design market policies will start to become quite important. Okay, next slide. And of course, we live in a global world. There's, because of our interconnectedness, I suppose that's why, one of the reasons why the pandemic has got to this stage. But the G20 also is very mindful of using policy tools. And that's an excerpt from the Leaders Summit statement. But of course, we have to maintain economic and social cohesion. We have to limit the damage. Of course, we have to restore global growth. It's going to take a massive hit. We've been talking about global recession. Certainly for Australia, we have not had a recession for going on 27 years. And now we are facing recession at the same time as a global recession. So as markets around the world shrink, that's going to affect every single country. So the idea here is we really collectively have to try and get out of this pandemic in the best possible shape in terms of our health and in terms of our economies. It is very much a global call to arms. Okay, next slide. So I've called it, what does it all mean? But we're all talking about the new normal. So some of the questions I've posed, and I don't have answers, but some of the things we're going to have to really think about, and this is not an exhaustive list, but what will the economic stimulus packages, or how will they ultimately be funded? There's been a lot of talk about increasing taxes, maybe reduced services. The current government we've got in Australia is prefers a small government as opposed to big government. But at the moment, it's very much big government. So ideologically, it's done an about face. But does that mean, and they usually are the ones that cut the taxes. So does it mean if they stay in government, there's going to be increase in taxes? What does it all mean? Who's going to pay for it in the end? It's also turned on its head some of the economic policies and economic approaches that we've had for decades. So does it mean we're going to completely change our view of economic policy? Does it mean that things like quantitative easing are not going to be regarded in a bad light as a last resort? How and when will these so-called temporary measures be unwound? Nobody really knows. How we seek to unwind them will make a big difference to what kind of state we're in at the end of all of this. Does it mean that there's going to be structural changes to our budgetary processes and systems? Certainly for Australia, there's been a lot of controversy about the unemployment benefit being too low. Now it's being doubled through the pandemic. There'll be a lot of people, and some people already saying that it should remain at that level after the pandemic. But again, how are we going to afford this? And what does it mean for labour and workplace laws? There's been a lot of talk that the digital age and embracing it, things like telehealth, for example. I saw in the UK some of the things around telehealth. People have been talking about them for the last 2 decades, and now in a matter of days, these things are happening. So the pandemic has accelerated a lot of things, like embracing the digital age. So many people are now working from home, for example. But are we ready for this? Are we ready for the transformation? Are we ready for what it means for urban planning and transport and so on? Next slide. And what does it mean for things like the universal basic wage? I mean, the future of work. I was at a George Washington University conference the other year about, the Industrial Revolution 4.0, and there was a lot of talk about the universal basic wage. And what does it mean? If the robots were to take over, can governments afford to pay us a universal basic wage? There's already more of that now happening. Is it sustainable? Is it viable? Again, how can we afford it? Then of course, what does the pandemic mean for international trade and supply chains and diversification? I know for Australia, we have the greatest exposure to China of any country in the world. Our concentration on one trade partner is quite overwhelming, and we've been trying to diversify for a long time. So it might be that the pandemic accelerates that process of diversification. We've also seen problems with some of our supply chains. I heard that in the United States, 95% of the market for masks and ventilators and respirators come from China. So it might be that we need to diversify our supply chains. In Australia, I know there's been a lot of talk about reintroducing a lot of the manufacturing that has disappeared, because we're not really a manufacturing country. But all of a sudden, we have found ourselves trying to pivot to start manufacturing all sorts of health and medical supplies. What does it mean for social policy? I mentioned before, all of these people potentially, over 1 billion people potentially being driven into poverty. What does it mean for them? What does it mean for the rest of us? What about the safety nets? Can they cope? There's a very good chance that they might not be able to cope, especially in developing countries. And are developed countries in a position, and will they be in a position to help developing countries? And what does it mean for international organizations? We've already seen the US and President Trump cancel payments to the WHO. But what does it also mean for others like the United Nations, the International Labour Organization, the IMF, the World Bank Group, the G20, the World Trade Organization? There's already been lots of calls for reform. But what does it also mean for funding and relevance? How have they helped us through the pandemic? Has there been a global call to arms, or is it every country for itself? So I think all of these things need to be considered. And of course, are we ready for the next pandemic? And lots of scientists are talking about pandemics and epidemics into the future. So what will be the new normal, and what will be the new economic normal going forward? We don't really know. No one knows. No one's got a crystal ball. A lot of people are making predictions and a lot of people are talking about it. But I think my view is that I'm pretty sure that it's not going to be the same as before. It will be a new world. And what we do today will very much shape that new world going forward. Okay, so that's the end of my formal presentation. And I leave it at there. So Ayman, over to you.
Vicky, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fantastic, and it's been very comprehensive here. And so there's a couple of ways I want to do this. I want to ask everybody that if they want to write some questions, they can put them in the Q&A section over here, and then I'll go through them and answer them live. I'll ask you the question, and then you can answer them here. So I'll just give some of the attendees a couple of seconds to write their questions here. But let me start with a question here. With all these services and funding available and grants and loans, who's going to pay for all of this?
Yeah, this is the big question. Who is going to pay for all of it? The government has basically had to borrow a lot of the money. I mean, we were kind of in a lucky position because our government had just come out of debt. So we have spent the last 12 years paying back the deficit from the global financial crisis. And this year the government was delivering a surplus, a small surplus. Now that surplus has gone, gone down the proverbial, as we call it. So it means that we're going to be in debt and deficit probably for at least another 10 years. So in terms of paying for it, governments are borrowing, governments are going into debt. And debt levels for individuals and businesses will also increase. So of course, being more debt laden across the economy is going to have consequences for all of us going forward.
So let me ask another question here. You mentioned the role of organizations. Talk a little bit about your organization. I know you play two hats, but as an IPA, what are you all doing to help support this? And then also you are the Senior Vice President on ICSB. What do you think the role of ICSB in this as well?
Yeah, good questions. I'll tackle IPA first. So we're one of the professional accounting bodies in Australia, like CPA in the US. And our members are very much at the front line of enabling businesses and individuals to access the stimulus measures. So, you know, the government makes all these announcements, splashes all this money around, but in terms of accessing it and what you then do with it and how you deploy that money to keep your business going, I mean, we talk about survival tactics for business and business continuity plans. So our members are very much at the front line of advising businesses on how to make sure that they have the best recovery plan possible and the best survival plan possible. So we've been completely inundated with queries and questions and people seeking guidance on how to navigate all of these stimulus measures, what to do with this money, how to look after their employees, what's the best way forward. So we're very much sort of advisors to business, and you know, and even our own business, making sure that we're surviving as much as possible. I mean, we're probably in a pretty good position financially, so that helps. But also, we've been doing a lot of lobbying with government. For example, we recently had a win in terms of removing what we call regulatory roadblocks. So previously, you know, there's a lot of red tape, and, you know, we've been, you know, everyone lobbies for reductions in red tape and better regulation. And it's amazing, the pandemic has meant that the government is quite happy to remove a whole lot of red tape if it means that businesses can access the stimulus packages better. So we've had some wins with government just lobbying to say, remove this bit of red tape and remove this other bit of red tape so that businesses can more effectively utilise the stimulus money. And that's been really good. The government here has been quite responsive and is really listening to our lobbying efforts in terms of removing a lot of the red tape. So we're doing a lot of advocacy as well. And then in terms of the ICSB, I think a lot of it, again, is giving guidance and support to its various members across the world. And I think disseminating best practice and giving guidance on how to get through the pandemic in terms of making sure that small businesses stay as healthy as possible. So disseminating some of the information and the knowledge, for example, through webinars, and sharing experiences. You know, what works in one country might be usable or adaptable to another country or to businesses at a micro level. So I think there's the macro approach and talking about things at the policy government level, but also very much at the micro level. You know, there's a lot of, for example, there's a lot of digital technologies out there that are going to work with small businesses, no matter where they are, no matter what country you're in. There's a lot of things that we can all share. And I think, Iman, one of the things that you did for ICSB with education going online, I thought the competition was a brilliant idea, because all of a sudden, everyone's pivoting to education online. I mean, we're the same. We do a lot of education. And we already had a lot online, but suddenly everything has to go online. And there's so many different platforms and different technology. So being able to facilitate that sharing of knowledge and ideas and experiences, I think is a great platform for ICSB. So I applaud you in bringing those things forward. And I think that's, you know, the hub and for all those, you know, if you haven't already looked at the ICSB website, I think there's a lot of really, really good information and guidance that we can all benefit from. So I'd encourage everyone to have a look, to have a good look at all the resources on the ICSB website if you haven't already.
So Vicky, here comes a difficult question here. This comes from a person that is that's more bottom line. He goes, you know, now we say, let's save as many small businesses as possible or micro businesses as possible. But at some point, we kind of like we say, listen, you know, if you're at some point, you either survive and you move forward or you call it a day and kind of like the survival of the most adaptable, right? And we're going to come to that decision as saying no more bailouts, no more this, no more that. Either reinvent your business model, combination of online, offline, or you cease to exist just because you're a small business. It doesn't mean that you have to exist. There's other ways you can do business other than just being a small business. So it's cutthroat, but it's reality post-COVID-19. What's your reaction to this?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's already happening. There's already a lot of businesses that have failed, have decided to shut the doors. And when I say failed, I mean failed for different reasons. But there's already a lot of people who have decided, and I'm talking about especially like micro businesses, who have decided that it's not worth it, they're not going to survive. And people have to make those hard decisions and those hard choices because not everyone is going to be saved. Not every small business is going to get through this. Not every large business is going to get through this. I mean, you look at the airline industry, there's massive airline businesses that are going to not survive this. So I think that's inevitable. But coming out of COVID-19, there will be businesses that will start up. There will be some businesses that will flourish through COVID-19. I mean, I know people in the medical technology industry who are absolutely, you know, flourishing at the moment and will probably continue to do so. So it's going to be, yeah, there will be some businesses that aren't going to make it, and there'll be others that will do well, and there'll be ones that will start up later. And governments have to also make tough decisions because not everyone can be saved. Well, not everyone can be bailed out. Again, it comes back to how long is it going to take us to pay for all of this, you know, maybe the rest of our lives kind of thing. But yeah, those tough decisions definitely have to be made.
So here comes another question here. And this is also maybe relates to many other countries as well. It goes, SMEs are creative and innovative when it comes to new technologies. But what about how will SMEs embrace this new trend in rural Australia, in the outskirts, if you may?
Yeah, it's very interesting because there's been a lot of controversy here and criticism about our, what we call NBN, which is, you know, the rollout of sort of high speed, do you call it NBN? I don't think you call it NBN there, but, you know, high speed internet connections. Australia is a laggard when it comes to high speed internet connections. So it's been bad for small businesses and any businesses probably in rural and regional areas. And it's something that we definitely have to fix in this country, because it's all very well to talk about everyone going online, but if you don't have stable, fast internet connections, then you're going to be impacted negatively. I mean, even now with COVID-19 and everyone working from home, you know, one of the big questions was, well, will the internet collapse in Australia? You know, do we have the capacity? Do we have the bandwidth? I mean, sometimes I'm on Zoom meetings and a little message comes up saying, oh, your connection is unstable because there's so much heavy traffic. You know, even the live streaming and Netflix and all of those were told to sort of, that they were being affected because too many people were accessing Netflix, for example. So those kind of infrastructure issues are definitely alive and well in Australia, and are something that we have to really hurry up, and we should have done better in this area anyway. And the pandemic hopefully will accelerate our addressing of that problem.
ICSB a couple of weeks ago sent out a massive campaign, called it an audacious plan. ICSB audacious plan, and it was very audacious, and it called for many things. One of the things it called for here is that for nurses and that are on the front line to be considered as veterans, Army veterans. And today in Time magazine, and the front cover, the nurses were said, we felt like we were on the front line of a war, right? I know this is not the topic of SMEs, but what is your reaction to the new reality that we're fighting different types of battles, and might not be military battles, but should we rethink our way of even looking at the different roles in society? And what is then the role of SMEs or MSMEs in society? You know, are they just businesses that are small, or do they play a different role? And what might that be if we're rethinking in an audacious plan?
Yeah, I mean, look, definitely in Australia, our Prime Minister keeps referring to us as being at war. So definitely then that would mean that the nurses and the medical workers are at the front line of the war. I mean, they're the ones that are putting their lives on the line every single day, just like you would be if you were a soldier fighting in a war. And even wars these days are fought differently. There's a lot of, unmanned drones and all sorts of things. So everything is changing, and it's changing rapidly. So I think definitely people like nurses and doctors and medical workers, and it's a whole lot of the support people as well, are all sort of frontline troops in a war. And we've got to have a war mentality about fighting the pandemic, because that's what it's like. It's lots of people are calling it the unseen enemy. And that's what it is. And it's an enemy that might stay with us for a long time. We might not actually get rid of it. I mean, I've been reading stuff that's been talking about we're going to have to learn to manage it, because we're not going to eradicate it. So, which means, to your point, that we will have to look at things very differently. I mean, if we've got an unseen enemy amongst us, and it might not just be this virus, it could be other viruses and other superbugs, all sorts of other things, then we're going to be kind of at war, as it were, with different enemies, and we're going to have to think of different ways to fight them, which of course means that, SMEs and MSMEs are going to have a different role to play. And I think we're all going to have to have we're all going to have to think about our different roles. And I think things like social policy are going to be sort of, turned on its head, because we've already been talking about climate change and climate action and things like that. But again, it's kind of like it takes a collective will to really fight some of these things. So the way we approach these problems and these so-called wars is going to have to change. And the role of MSMEs, I think, is going to come to the fore. Because this is really kind of like the coalface, it's the grassroots, it's more people that are working in the smaller businesses, and what is their role. It's to me, it is already more than just a business. I mean, we all have to have some kind of social conscience if we're going to fight, whether it's climate wars or virus wars or any other kind of unseen war going forward. So it could be cyber war, for example. I mean, one of the worst things about the pandemic, as well as killing people, is just the cyber wars. Cyber crime has skyrocketed during the pandemic. So it's another unseen war that we're fighting. And all of us, including SMEs and MSMEs, have to be more vigilant in fighting some of these wars. And we all have to speak up and call it out, and hopefully change behaviour. Otherwise, I think we're going to be, well, I was going to say doomed, but I don't want to be too negative about it.
There's one question here that's difficult, and then we'll start to wrap it up here. It goes, COVID-19 has made each country and region to rethink their participation in the global economy. Do you think that supply chains will become more local and regional? How should SMEs then embrace the bringing back of supply chains, choosing local?
Yeah, I think, and this is something I touched on before, is the impact on supply chains. There's already been a lot of talk about, less globalization and more localized supply chains. I mean, in some ways it's going to be difficult because we rely on, trade, we rely on imports and exports. We can't produce everything ourselves. So there's a limit to the supply chains. I mean, like food security, for example, is a big one. you know, a lot of people are talking about you have to have food security in times of war. So supply chains in terms of food production might change, but there'll be lots of other things that won't be able to change, like automotive parts, for example. It's not like suddenly we're all going to be producing our own motor vehicles. I mean, in Australia, we stopped manufacturing motor vehicles altogether a few years ago. So I think it's going to be inevitable that there'll be a period of inward looking. Countries, you know, and not every country will be the same, but I think there's already people starting to think more nationally and more nationalistically as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to the supply chains. But I think definitely there'll be more people sort of inward looking. Global trade had already started to slow down. So it was kind of a worrying trend for countries like Australia that very much small open economies. We need the world to the world trade to keep going up, not down. So, and I think for a lot of MSMEs, it's going to be difficult. A lot might depend on what industry you're in. I mean, some supplies, some things you can get locally, but I think there's a limit to it for most of us. It depends a lot on the industry you're in. So I think it will be interesting to see how it plays out going forward. I think there might be more of a focus on quality as well, because I think one thing the pandemic has shown us is that not everything we import is of high quality when it counts. Sometimes it doesn't matter, but sometimes it does. So there's been talk about, you know, things like, I mean, you could talk to this better than me, but I really like the idea about frugal innovation. And I think that's a fantastic sort of concept and idea that has been around for a while, but I think things like frugal innovation, doing more with less, is going to become probably a bigger focus of a lot of people. So, and frugal innovation is also good because one of the ideas behind it is to be more inclusive. So in terms of putting that safety net under the more vulnerable people, frugal innovation might be helpful. So I think that, you know, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think it will be different, and I think there'll be more people, at least initially, looking inward. But hopefully we'll, as a global, you know, I mean, we're still going to be globally connected. And I think this will be, a lot will also depend on the global institutions that I talked about and what role they're going to play. Because if the global institutions start to change and sort of become less relevant, then that will aid sort of that inward looking nationalism, I think. So we need our global institutions to stay strong.
We have a guest attendee that insisted to come to the session because he thought it was critically important, the topic that you're presenting, and also the amount of information here. So I'm going to ask him to introduce himself and just to give some comments as well. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Ayman. This is Ahmed Osman. I'm president of ICSB. And first of all, I'd like to thank you very much, Vicky, for this very, very informative presentation. It shows a lot of experience. It gave us an overview of what Australia is doing to fight this pandemic, and the overall picture in Australia, obviously, on the health side, looks very good. And I hope it stays this way, and I hope that yourself and your family are all safe. I'd like to thank you, Vicky, on behalf of ICSB's board for all the efforts you've been doing over the last 2 years on our board. Obviously, the work you've been doing is great, and with the new changes happening, this will also be positively affecting the future of ICSB. Obviously, today's webinar has covered a very important dimension or pillar of ICSB, which is the policy dimension. We have had previous webinars covering education, research, and obviously practice and other things. But I am sure that these webinars have, if people thought they would be feeling lonely staying at home, I think these webinars have brought us all together in a global, dialogue for the benefit of educators, students, and MSME owners worldwide. So I thank you once again, Vicky, for this presentation on behalf of ICSB's board. And thank you, Ayman, also for all your efforts.
Thank you very much. So, Vicky, So Vicky, let's leave it with, I'm going to ask you the last question. This might be your the last remarks here. Don't think with your mind, you know, feel with your heart, and then explain to us, what's the future going to be like?
Yeah, this is a tough one. Look, my feeling and my hope in my heart is that it's going to be positive, that we're going to limit the death and destruction from the pandemic, and that we're going to come out of it stronger and more united. And that it's going to teach us a lot of lessons, a lot about humanity. Hopefully it will bring out the best of us, and that we're going to look after each other, and we're going to see the value of looking after each other and being very much together. So that's really, I think, that's my hope and that's my feeling. And that's, you know, that's what I'm going to be working towards. And I think if everyone sort of looks after their fellow human, then the world will be a better place.
Eloquently said, and I think this is the best closing line we can have for a webinar like this from all the way from Australia. I want to thank you for your time and effort and dedication to putting this together. I know this is a lot of work putting all this together, and I want to thank you and your team as well for doing this. On behalf of the president of ICSB and ICSB as well, we thank you, and we also thank the IPA for supporting ICSB on many different activities that they had. We wish you well, stay safe, and send our greetings to everybody in Australia. Say ICSB sends a big social distance hug, right? And we look forward to seeing you guys as well very soon. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Ayman. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And thank you, President Osman. And thank you so much. And yes, we give you a virtual hug back.